It is the first round of the fantasy playoffs, and if you need to make some big, bold, risky starts that could win your matchup this week, I have got quarterback, running back, receiver, and tight end options for you to take big swings at securing your first round victory. As always, drop your start sit questions in the chat. Let's go ahead and dive in and get those wins. I know that it is the very last thing that you want to do, but if you are in a rough spot and you are looking for a streaming option at quarterback and Marcus Mariota was already taken, JJ McCarthy is a valid option for you to turn to. Now, he's an extremely volatile option whose ceiling is a QB1 performance and whose floor is literally finishing below backup quarterbacks. I'm not joking. I wish I were joking, but it happened multiple times this season, despite the fact that JJ McCarthy has only started 7 games. That is legitimately crazy. But he is a boom bust player, and there is not much in between for him. So the good news is that for the most part, the games have been very predictable. Aside from one of his matchups against Chicago, he has generally taken advantage of easy matchups against the pass and failed in difficult matchups. It's very simple. And this week's matchup against Dallas presents an excellent opportunity for him to build on his Week 14 success, where he completed 16 of 23 attempts for just 163 yards, but he did get 3 touchdowns, and it was his first 0 turnover performance of the year, so yay for him. He managed to get a top 12 performance purely from a passing perspective without having to add too much on the ground. That was great to see. Earlier in the season, I must admit, I did talk about JJ McCarthy as a streaming option rest of season and Justin Jefferson as a trade candidate purely for one specific reason, the playoff schedule. It was the playoff schedule, people. And this week's matchup against Dallas is the start of a very easy run for him. Dallas's defensive additions have made an improvement overall. I can say that. But the one area that they're clearly still struggling in is against the pass. Quarterbacks are throwing for volume and plenty of touchdowns as long as they don't have a running back that is literally a touchdown magnet. Hello, Jahmyr Gibbs. But quarterbacks typically average over 2 touchdowns a game against Dallas. The improvement on Dallas's defense has been in limiting yardage to running backs. Minnesota's running game is struggling. It just makes logical sense that this will be another multi-touchdown game for JJ McCarthy. Jerry Jeudy has been the bane of every fantasy manager's existence for the entire year, but along with Shedeur Sanders' breakout performance in Week 14 against Tennessee, Jerry Jeudy had one of his best performances of the year, finishing as wide receiver 12 in half PPR with 3 receptions on 5 targets for 76 yards and a touchdown. But the big question that we have is, can we actually trust Jerry Jeudy to repeat that level of performance? Because aside from one single game this season, his other single touchdown game, this type of performance was by far an outlier for him. And Sanders threw for 364 yards, but it was a very well-balanced distribution of those yards between Jeudy, Harold Fannin, and both of the Cleveland running backs via checkdowns. But we are seeing week-over-week improvement from Sanders, and this matchup against Chicago presents another opportunity for him to continue on that improvement. And Jerry Jeudy, at the very least, does appear to have separated himself as the clear wide receiver 1, away from Cedric Tillman and Isaiah Bond. Jerry Jeudy still is a very extremely risky start this week. But if you're going to take a risk in any matchup, Chicago is absolutely one of the better targets. And it does help that the wide receivers who tend to thrive in terms of touchdowns against Chicago have been wide receivers in recent weeks like Christian Watson, A.J. Brown, Jordan Addison, big play receivers, and Jerry Jeudy does fit that build. Rome Odunze is unlikely to play this week, and while we didn't see a big performance from Luther Burden in Week 14, and much to the chagrin of fantasy managers everywhere, the wide receiver that got the touchdown was Olamide Zaccheaus, of all people, Luther Burden still stepped up and performed well as the wide receiver 1. Burden had 4 receptions on 6 targets for 67 yards, and it was not a big day, but it was modest, safe production in a very difficult matchup against Green Bay. And for our purposes, it was good to see how he does in difficult matchups because he has yet another difficult matchup against Cleveland. But here's the kicker, though. Cleveland's defense is not an impossible team to succeed against, as showcased by Tennessee last week. So Burden will have the opportunity to build on that volume and that success that he saw last week. DJ Moore will likely see the tougher coverage, and then based on pure volume, Luther Burden can have another solid day. His ceiling may not be super high, but he does give us a solid floor, and there is a little bit of a kicker here. The ceiling could elevate. This could be one of those big boom, high risk, high performance games from him because of the added benefit of Chicago's defense being so bad that at the very least, it is entirely possible that Shedeur Sanders and the Browns can push the ball very well against Chicago and force this to be a higher volume game, making this a possibility for Luther Burden to have that big breakout performance. I like Deebo Samuel this week, and that might seem counterintuitive because the return of Terry McLaurin has definitely put a major damper on his fantasy production, but we love the matchup this week. The New York Giants are essentially the friendliest defense that you can face in general, and Marcus Mariota should be able to attack this defense very well. Samuel has been underwhelming as of late. We talked about it. He had just 9 fantasy points and 5 fantasy points in each of the past 2 games. But to be very fair, those were difficult matchups against Denver and Minnesota. Denver has allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receiver, and Minnesota has allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So despite the difficult matchups, I'm not that discouraged here because at least he has seen decent volume and he's not struggling with his targets. There aren't a whole bunch of major dramatic drops or struggles or anything. He caught 5 of his 7 targets against Denver and 4 of his 6 targets against Minnesota. Week 15 is the perfect setup for a bounce back game for him to get on track and have a massive ceiling game. We did see this matchup way back when in week 1, and that's a long time ago, but it was a good matchup. He finished as the wide receiver 5 overall in half PPR. I talked about Kayshon Boutte in the waiver wire video, and he absolutely remains a priority and a high upside start here. He is a fantastic option for this round in the playoffs and in the playoffs in general, really. And he can serve as a low-end flex option with legitimate upside because of the touchdowns that he gives you. He is consistently on the field, upwards of 70% of snaps. He has been incredibly reliable throughout the season, catching 29 of his 38 targets. That's a 76% catch rate, very impressive. And he is a huge big play threat with 6 touchdowns on the season. And when we're looking at wide receivers, we're turning to a lot of guys that really don't consistently give us touchdown opportunities. And that is one thing that we have been able to rely on with Kayshon Boutte. He is literally tied for the 8th most touchdowns this year for receivers. And very impressive considering the lack of targets that he's gotten overall. But this week's matchup does make him a little bit riskier play because straight up, it is just not a good matchup here. This is a rematch from week 5, and in that matchup, Kayshon Boutte had just 3 receptions on 3 targets for 43 yards. But we have seen Buffalo be a little vulnerable recently. They just got tore up by T. Higgins and the snow. They can be very hit or miss. One week you see them shut down a receiving core, and the next week you see them get torn up by Tua, Waddle, and Malik Washington. So this is a big swing and a big game. It's also a big game here because it is a big divisional game, because if New England can win, they can solidify their place at top of the division. If Buffalo loses, they're almost certainly playing on the road in round 1. So this could be a very intriguing high upside game all around. If you're looking for a high upside swing at tight end, you can turn to Isaiah Likely this week. Mark Andrews is the one that just got paid, but it is Isaiah Likely who appears to be on the cusp of a little hot streak here. Likely has given us back-to-back tight end 1 performances of 13 fantasy points in PPR against Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. Of course, those have been very generous matchups for tight ends. In fact, they are literally the 2 most generous matchups that you can have for tight ends this season, which is obviously why we've seen this rise in performance from Isaiah Likely. But that's okay. That's why we are happy here. This week's matchup is against Cincinnati again. So we've got a great matchup and a direct baseline of what a performance can look like for him this week. In week 13 against Cincinnati, Likely had 5 receptions on 6 targets for 95 yards. And quite frankly, both of the last 2 performances could have been even better, particularly last week with the controversial touchdown call that should have been a touchdown. Now, we have talked about the downturn in production for tight ends recently. Several of our guys have failed for us. We thought they would pull through. They did not. Brenton Strange, Darren Waller, massive disappointments last week. Travis Kelce looked a hot mess. Tyler Warren's production has been inconsistent, and now he has to deal with this sideways quarterback situation. It might be the best move to just turn to the guy that has the best matchup, and that is exactly what Isaiah Likely is this week. Mark Andrews does exist, obviously, but in terms of the guys that I would rather play between these two, it's Isaiah likely. Andrews just doesn't get good volume. He's touchdown dependent, and when those touchdowns hit, they hit. And they definitely could come through this week. I'm not saying that you can't play him, but it is a little bit riskier. And if they don't hit, he is a complete bust. At least we have some level of a floor that we can expect from likely, and we have the elevated ceiling because of the matchup here. Now a running back. Yes, you can turn to Dylan Sampson this week. It is interesting. And I think it's worth highlighting because I take a ridiculous amount of start-sit questions throughout the week. And guys like Chris Rodriguez come up consistently. But as we've talked about here before, while he is the starting running back, there's just not a super high ceiling for him, and that is unlikely to really change. So if you were looking for a potential risky start here, you're out of options, you need to turn to somebody who can give you some level of a ceiling, who can win the week for you, you might want to lean towards a running back like Dylan Sampson. Now, heading into the season, I thought very highly of Dylan Sampson. I thought that it would work out as Kayshon Judkins as the early down back and the goal line back, and that Sampson would play a nice complementary role as a pass catcher. That did not pan out that way, but due to a variety of coaching decisions and quarterback inconsistencies, finally, I think we have made it here. Shedeur Sanders has started 3 games, and in 2 of those games, Sampson has caught a pass for big yardage, and we are seeing solid usage of the running backs in the pass game. While starting a backup running back for a legitimately awful team sounds, again, probably counterintuitive. I like that word today, apparently. A matchup against Chicago is extremely juicy. If you have been starting non-effective and non-producing backs and you're starting them because they're lead backs, but they're not giving you the upside that you need, it might be worth looking at Sampson if your league is full PPR. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. You can find me across all social media platforms at It's Tara Time, so make sure that you are locked in, subscribed, tuned in, turn on notifications. I'm dropping videos constantly for you guys, and you can always turn into my live shows on Wednesday at 8 p.m. EST to ask me any questions that you got. Again, we are closing out the fantasy season strong, and then we are heading into the off season and covering a ton of fun topics like free agency, draft content, incoming rookies, Senior Bowl, Combine, all of that good stuff. So stick around. It is fantasy football all season long and all off season long. So make sure that you're locked in with me.